Hello viewers. As the title suggests, in this video I'm going to compare a few budgetary and economic ratios of Canada and USA to draw plausible deductions that may be of interest to the viewers. When you have to compare two countries like the USA and Canada based on budgetary and economic factors, then it may involve calculation of various numbers and ratios that, if not professionally curtailed, may bog down the viewers in a complete confusion. However, it must be understood that without numbers one cannot make an objective comparison. So while working on this video, I kept in mind both the issues and tried to rely on numbers and ratios but to an acceptable minimal level. Therefore, this analysis may not be exhaustive. And for that matter, no analysis is ever exhaustive, yet it is going to satiate the knowledge appetite of a large number of viewers who are also time constrained. So without much ado, let's start the analysis. The first point in any analysis is to set the benchmarks that will ensure objectivity. In our case, the benchmarks are federal budgetary revenues, federal budgetary expenses, national debt, gross domestic product or GDP, population, and vulnerable persons such as poor persons and those on social security. The second point is set the year for comparison. In our case, this is year 2019 because it was a normal year prior to COVID pandemic. Thirdly, I have expressed all monetary values in US dollars to compare oranges with oranges, or for that matter, apples with apples. Fourthly, it is the federal budget figures that are compared, ignoring provincial and state budgets to keep the analysis simple and understandable. Finally, the analysis will use ratios to make an objective comparison because of significantly different sizes of two economies, size of population in two countries, size of GDP, different budgetary classifications, and so on. Let us quickly look at some of the key numbers for Canada and USA that we will use in our ratio analysis. All monetary values are expressed in billions of US dollars. This table tells us that revenue resources of USA government are massive when compared with Canada's resources. Whether it is direct taxes, indirect taxes, or other sources of revenue, Canada's resources are only a fraction when compared with the USA. At least we can say that Canada is a small country in terms of budgetary resources when compared with the USA. This table confirms that Canada is not only small in terms of budgetary resources, but also in terms of budgetary expenses when compared with the USA. Does it also signify something different? We'll explore it in a while. These statistics tell us that Canada has about 1/10 population when compared with the USA, while in terms of geographical area, Canada is slightly bigger, albeit not significantly. However, in terms of the size of national debt and GDP, USA is far bigger than Canada. When it comes to needy persons, USA has far more such persons than Canada. Who are needy persons? This category may include poor people, old-aged persons, and disabled persons. A quick review of these statistics tell us that USA is a massive country in terms of economic and budgetary resources when compared with Canada, although both countries are almost equal in terms of geographical area. However, these statistics don't tell us clearly the relative size of each country from budgetary, economic, and ameliorative perspectives. In order to get an insight into it, we must dive further and look at some interesting ratios. This graph tells us about the size of two countries in budgetary, economic, and demographic terms based on year 2019. I may add that 2019 is not the calendar year for all values because the USA and Canada fiscal years straddle between two calendar years. For example, in Canada the fiscal year starts on 1st April while in USA the fiscal year starts on 1st October. However, this fact will not significantly alter the findings presented in this video. Since USA is a huge country, therefore the size of Canada against all benchmarks is very small. For example, Canadian budgetary revenues and expenses are only 7% and 6% respectively when compared with USA. Similarly, national debt and GDP of Canada is 2% and 6% respectively when compared with USA. Finally, the size of population and persons on social security in Canada are only 11% and 10% respectively when compared with the USA. However, in terms of area or size, Canada is about 102% of the size of USA, that is slightly bigger. So what conclusion may be drawn from these ratios? Well, one fundamental deduction may be that Canada is really a tiny country in terms of budgetary, economic, and demographic terms, although it is slightly bigger than the US in terms of size. However, these ratios don't provide information beyond this point, so we need to widen the scope of our analysis by dissecting some of these ratios. This graph makes a comparison between USA and Canada federal budgetary revenues. It may be noted that both in the USA and Canada, the states and provinces also raise revenues through taxes and other levies, and the federal governments only share certain provincial expenses, notably social security expenses. Anyway, the orange curve is the USA while blue curve is Canada. On the horizontal axis, different sources of federal government revenues are grouped into three categories to make the analysis simple. These categories include direct taxes, indirect taxes, and other revenues. The vertical axis reflects a percentage of each source of revenue. The USA has a higher percentage of direct taxes, that is 92% when compared with 67% of Canada. However, in case of indirect taxes and other revenues, Canada has a higher share of 17% and 15% respectively when compared with USA's percentage of 5% and 2%. One simple conclusion drawn from this analysis is that in USA the gap between direct and indirect taxes is almost 87%, while in Canada this gap is only 50%. This may imply that USA has a more progressive taxation system than Canada. This graph compares important components of federal government expenses in Canada and USA. The blue curve represents Canada, while the orange curve represents the USA. Canada spends more in relative terms on social security and other government expenses than USA. For Canada, the percentages in these two categories are 60 and 28, while for USA they are 57 and 17. However, USA spends more on defense and interest expenses, where its percentages stand at 18 and 8, while that of Canada are 7 in both types of expenses. So in relative terms, Canada appears to be spending more on social security services, while USA can improve its social security spending if it rationalizes its massive defense expenditure that eats a whopping 18% federal resources. Anyway, choice rests with the policymakers. This graph depicts relative size of budget deficits of two countries. The USA has a much higher budget deficit that stands at 28% when compared with only 4% of Canada. A large budget deficit is never good for any country, especially if it persists over several years. In that case, it may indicate structural weaknesses in the economy, suggesting that government's policies are not expanding the economic activity and budgetary resources as desired. This slide shows a percentage size of less fortunate people living in both the countries. Less fortunate or needy persons include three categories of persons, that is disabled, poor, and old-aged. Interestingly, in all the three categories, the percentages are almost similar in both the countries. For example, USA has 41% disabled persons, while Canada has 40%. Similarly, Canada has 24% poor persons, while in the USA this percentage stands at 23%. Finally, in case of old-aged persons, both countries have the same percentage of 36%. So the demographic structure of needy population is almost identical in both the countries. This graph represents US dollar spending on each needy person in both the countries. Since the USA has a significantly higher budgetary resources, therefore it appears to be spending a higher average sum of $16,926 per needy person when compared with Canadian figure of $10,068. However, these are average figures. The actual size of spending per needy person may depend upon the robustness of the social security system in identifying a deserving population segment and spending money on a fair basis. That is beyond the scope of this study. National debt to GDP ratio is an acceptable benchmark for determining whether a country's national debt is within manageable limits or not. There is no absolute measure of a safe limit. However, most of the countries try to keep this ratio within 60%. So from this perspective, the USA with a debt to GDP ratio of 106% appears to be vulnerable and a highly geared country, while Canadian ratio of 40% is within acceptable limit. Economists may disagree on the interpretation of this ratio. Many believe that the threshold of 60% must be maintained on an annual basis, while others may argue that the 60% threshold may be maintained in the medium to long term. Lastly, we may look at the Gini coefficient of both the countries to see how far income or wealth distribution is fair in each country. Those of you who are not familiar with the Gini coefficient may know that it is a statistical measure of fair distribution of wealth in a country. Its values may range from 0 to 1. 0 implies absolute equality, while 1 or 100 implies absolute inequality. USA's Gini coefficient value is 41.4, while that of Canada is 29.9. This means Canada has more fair distribution of wealth than the USA. No wonder few hundred billionaires and several million poor people in the USA may be a testimony to this fact. To sum up, the following budgetary, economic, and ameliorative perspectives emerge from this analysis. Canada's budgetary resources are about 7% when compared with USA. However, USA also has a large population, and in terms of distribution of budgetary resources, Canada spends more on social security of its people. That implies an equitable allocation of budgetary resources. The size of budget deficit is also very large in USA, that stands at 28% when compared with 4% of Canada. Large budget deficits are signs of poor budgetary planning, and if it persists for several years, it may be a harbinger of an economic collapse. The debt to GDP ratio of USA is 106%, that is far above than the acceptable threshold of 60% for most countries, while for Canada it is 40%, that is within the acceptable limit. So USA is a highly geared country at this point in time, and it may be an indicator of poor budgetary and economic policies. The Gini coefficient of 41.4 in case of USA shows more unfair distribution of wealth than 29.9 for Canada. So again, from equity perspective, Canada appears to be a better country. I hope you enjoyed this video. For future updates, please do subscribe and share my channel. Thank you for watching.